This meeting's being recorded. Okay, go ahead. Thank you, Art.
Well, good evening, and Julia. I want to thank you for that great introduction. I couldn't have written it better myself.
Yeah, right.
Again, thank you all for attending tonight. And as Julia mentioned, I live in Boulder, Colorado, but that's mostly during the ski season, and I try to spend as much time during the spring and summer in Pentwater. So it's really nice to be able to give this presentation to you. That's really specific about something I'm very passionate about, something very dear to my heart, and that's dealing with the Great Lakes and water quality associated with that. Back in the day, I went to school at Michigan State University, and my major emphasis was in water quality, fisheries and wildlife. And so I've been spending probably about the past 4 or 5 years really interested in the problems that are associated with microplastics in the Great Lakes. So that's kind of the major thrust of my presentation tonight. There's going to be a couple themes about the presentation tonight, so if I mention them to you right now. There's one theme is you're going to hear it a lot. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. Okay, that's going to be said a lot. And the second thing is probably going to hear a lot. It's complex. It's complicated. It sounds like a bad relationship, but it's a complex issue that I hope you get a sense of that as I go through some of the details about microplastics and their impacts. Next slide.
You see it?
I can see it.
Okay.
So I've lived all of my life on Lake Michigan. I'm originally from the Benton Harbor, St. Joseph, Michiana area. And I went to high school in North Muskegon. So I've grown up on the lake all of my life. And through the 68 years that I've been alive, Lake Michigan has just taken a lot of abuse. And I'm sure that some of these bullet items that I have on the slide here are not necessarily new to you, but the lake has taken on a lot of abuse historically, from acquiring raw sewage, even before the Clean Water Act was initiated back in the 1970s, where municipalities would dump basically their raw sewage directly into the lake. You had industrial discharges from Waukegan, Chicago, Gary, all that particular area was just dumping a lot of pollution, toxic material early on in the 60s and 70s, even before that. We've had freighter discharges, ballast tank discharges. One of the things it's kind of been a success story is phosphorus, where phosphorus was causing these huge algae blooms in Lake Michigan. And I actually remember when I was swimming in Lake Michigan back in the 60s, that I would come out of the water and I would be coated with green algae because of the excess phosphorus. Well, luckily they put a detergent ban along the lake, the states, and stopped the use of phosphorus in detergents. And it was a real success story. And it kind of shows that something positive can happen if they make up their minds to it in terms of politics. We get polychlorinated biphenyls, and the huge thing has been invasive species affecting water quality, from the AOI to the zooplankton new species, the mussels that have moved in and taken over a huge niche within Lake Michigan. And then we got problems associated with combined sewer overflows, which is a combination of sanitary and stormwater sewers that go directly into the lake. Because of all these various types of impacts, just recently, especially the invasive species, the lake has had a huge decrease in its productivity, especially to support a viable fishery. So now we get into a new area called plastics, microplastics, called emergent water quality issue by the state of Michigan, meaning it's coming, but they don't have an idea what to deal with it. That's kind of what that term means. Next slide. So when they think of plastic in water, in aquatic systems, this is maybe one of the first things they think of are these gyres. And there's 5 main gyres in the oceans. And basically a gyre is basically a circulation pattern in the oceans. And what happens is that there's a lot of plastic pollution that feeds those gyres, primarily from Southeast Asia, Malaysia area that basically gets into these gyres and creates these huge mats. Next slide. This gives you a perspective of what they look like and just how big they are. 617,000 square miles. That's the surface area of 7 states of Michigan. It's an enormous size, and it's an enormous environmental problem. Next slide. Well, due to the it's like Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes have got their own little mini gyres, if you want to think of them that way, where there are specific circulation patterns. You can see in the top left graphic there that Lake Michigan and the larger type Great Lakes have got more of a counterclockwise circulation pattern, or each they have their own small little circular patterns, which is very evident down at the south part of Lake Michigan, where there's just not a whole lot of distribution of water through there, and it's kind of a closed system, pretty much down there around by the Chicago, Milwaukee area. And so what you can see on the bottom right is really kind of the concentration of plastic and microplastics that's associated with these circulation patterns. And you can see again the south part of Lake Michigan, in which I think Pentwater is like, or Waddington is like on the very tip of that yellow mark. But the yellow is really the higher density of plastic and microplastics. And as you might expect, they're associated with high metropolitan areas, Chicago, Gary, Milwaukee, and then down into Detroit, Cleveland, and also into Ontario. So there's kind of those little minor type circulation patterns that tend to accumulate plastic material. Next slide. Okay, so this is where it gets complicated, because plastic, it's integrated in a lot of things that we do basically in our life, if we like it or not. A lot of times we don't have choices in terms of trying to avoid it. But plastic is in a lot of materials that maybe we don't even realize, or we just choose to use. And it's from plastic bags that we get at Myers, food containers that we get at the grocery stores, the parts that are on our automobiles that are used for lightweight, so we don't have to use so much gasoline and emit so much greenhouse gases. Plastic that's used to cover vegetables, fresh vegetables, where they used to be more like open air type displays. Take out food containers. And then ultimately, you can see that the plastic materials for bottles, shampoos, and also for medical equipment. I mean, we need plastics. I mean, it's not like I'm trying to get rid of them, but I think there just needs to be a balance. We need to get into a situation where we don't get totally into a convenience sort of mind, a throwaway society type thing that ultimately has huge ramifications environmentally. Next slide. So plastics, again, it's a I'm not telling, probably a lot of you know this, but it's a synthetic. It's a semi-synthetic that's used in a lot of applications that I just mentioned. But the critical thing, it's made out of coal, natural gas, and crude oil. Basically, your basic fossil fuels. It's where it comes from. And a lot of it is used in packaging and beverage containers. To give you a picture of what a actual refinery for plastics looks like in terms of cracking. Next slide. So there's some main types of plastics that are manufactured. The polypropylene, used in a lot of packaging, auto parts, and textiles. Low density, that goes into the plastic bags, squeeze bottles, shrink wrap. That's kind of the single-use type bags that you get at the grocery stores. And then there's PET, which is used for water bottles, polyethylene. And then there's the high density that's used for milk cartons, shampoo bottles, etc. Then we get into polyvinyl chloride, which is more of your hard type plastics, piping, flooring. This material contains a lot of chlorine in its manufacturing, so it's very difficult, if not impossible, to recycle. And then we get into the polystyrene, the food containers that a lot of states try to get rid of. Luckily, here in Colorado, we've been able to get rid of the polystyrene. Next slide. So this is an accumulation of millions of tons of plastic over time. And there's a few things I just want to mention about this, because the accumulation of plastic kind of correlates with the production of plastic. And you can see that steep curve of the generation and management of plastic material from now all the way to 2050. And it's a huge steep incline. And what's going to happen is that the amount of plastic generated in the future in 2050 is going to be 3 times the amount that we are using right now. By 2025, there's going to be 55 million tons of CO2 that are going to be released from 42 new plastic plants. And they're equivalent to 27 coal-fired power plants in terms of their emissions. So this is just a huge amount of plastic that's basically going to be generated over the next 20 to 30 years. And it's primarily going to be in the Ohio River Valley. It's going to be the new petrochemical corridor in the Northeast. Again, primarily focused towards plastic production. So by 2030, almost 30%, 33% of the oil demand is going to be plastic. But that's when you go to 2050, it's going to be 50% of the oil demand is going to be used for plastic as opposed to transportation or types of other uses for fossil fuel. So this is a huge, huge increase in plastic that we're going to have to deal with. And it's going to be impossible for recycling to keep up with it. Next slide. A little bit about the dark side of plastics, what it contains. It's a nasty chemical. Even if you just smell it being burned, you know that something's really bad in it. There's additives that are put into the plastic for various types of reasons. And they have the characteristics of being what they call endocrine disruptors, which basically affects the fertility of human beings and also of most animals, aquatic or terrestrial. And it's the ability not to be able to reproduce, or it has a fertility or unborn child impact to it. So BBPA is very common in cans primarily. So the material that's held within a can doesn't pick up the metallic taste from the container. So it's that white sort of film that you see at the bottom of the can. Then there's also phthalates, which basically add flexibility to the plastic for various types of applications. So these two are endocrine disruptors. And they are an issue, a problem. And kind of a startling fact is that the fertility rates in the United States has decreased 30% over the past 35 years. That's almost 10% a year, almost, in terms of fertility rates, primarily in men, in terms of their sperm counts. So something's going on in regards to the type of chemicals that we're being exposed to from plastics and other types of sources that are affecting us as human beings. Next slide. So this just gives you an example of how much material is coming into the lake, how much plastic is coming into the Great Lakes. It's 22 million pounds of plastic per year comes into the Great Lakes. And unfortunately, Lake Michigan is #1. Almost half of the material, all the plastics being discharged in the Great Lakes is coming into Lake Michigan, followed by Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So, and 80% of the litter that we've seen, you've seen on the beaches is really related to plastic. Next slide. So what are microplastics? What's the definition of them? I think we all kind of got a feel for it, but it's plastic materials that are less than 5 millimeters. That's I don't know why they chose 5 millimeters, but that's kind of the convention right now, which is 3/16 of an inch. So you can actually see it. It's not like it's microscopic. It's readily available, observable. So there's a couple types of microplastics. The first one is called primary. And those are on purpose manufactured at that size of less than 5 millimeters. So it's manufactured specifically. And so those are kind of nurdles is one of them. I'm going to talk more about nurdles, but they are resin material that's used for plastics, manufacturing of plastics. Back in the day, there were microbeads in cosmetics, toothpaste, abrasion type soaps. Those are primary. And then we get into the secondary, and this is probably the one that people really think about most, is really the destruction of plastic materials, bottles, containers, that sort of thing, where they've been degraded by the sun, wave action, erosion, etc. And they've been beaten down into the less than 5 millimeter size. So it's a degradation type result. Also, microfibers from synthetic clothes are also considered to be, quote, a secondary type microplastic. And then we start getting into another type of size class. It's called nanoplastics. And these are like, you can't see these. These are like 10 to the -9 meters, if you remember your scientific notation. But these are the size that are really of concern, because these are the type of size that can get into fish tissue or into vegetation and being uptake in through the food chain. Next slide. A little bit about microfibers. Again, I mentioned that they are a secondary microplastic. Maybe we don't even think about them necessarily so much, but they are probably the major microplastic of concern in terms of abundance and density, and potentially even in terms of impacts to the aquatic environment. They are materials that are released from clothing that you can just get a sense of what they look like from the picture up on top. And they're just these fibers that, again, are less than 5 millimeters. They are basically discharged out of wastewater treatment plants because of the washing machines. And they are uptake quite a bit by zooplankton, which is part of the food chain, and also being consumed by fish. So microfibers, big deal. It's a big issue. Next slide. And so this one just kind of gives you a sense of just the increase of production of microfibers. polyester material over time. And just like the plastics ones I showed you with that steep curve, polyester is following that same sort of trend. Polyester is not going to go away anytime soon, and just going to continue to increase and increase. And therefore, we've got these microfibers that are continuing to be a concern. Next slide. So where does all these microplastics come from? So I'm just going to kind of walk through this a bit. There's a fair amount of sources here. Many of them you probably know, and maybe some of them are kind of new to you. Wastewater treatment plants. This is the kind of the focal point where sanitary sewer systems and stormwater sewer systems on the streets, etc., all get together and get treated and get discharged into a receiving stream, such as a river or directly into Lake Michigan. And so wastewater treatment plants are not designed to handle microfibers, even though you'll find out later on that they are somewhat successful in being able to do that. The other sources are microfibers that I mentioned from washing synthetic clothes, which really kind of bums me out because being a skier and an outdoor type guy, a lot of my clothes are synthetic, so I'm going to have to start really considering more cotton wool type clothing in the future to try to get rid of buying these types of clothes, or buying new ones, so I should say. Next slide. Then we've got your basic beach litter that we all are very familiar with. Living on Lake Michigan and Pontwater, usually I go out and collect plastic almost every other day. And so usually what I see in terms of like a priority is usually cigarette butts, cigar tips, plastic cups, straws, and pieces of styrofoam. That's kind of my top 6 that I usually run across. I'm sure that during your beach cleanup, it's very similar to type of observation. Cups, it's just trash that you see there. One that was really surprising are car tires. And if you think about it, there's a lot of abrasion that occurs from your car tires. Over time, you have to get them replaced. Well, that rubber's got to go someplace. And it gets into a very, very small fraction size that ultimately ends up on the road and gets into the storm sewer system during a rainstorm event that ultimately ends up at the wastewater treatment plant. And then you got the trash associated with people throwing their tires out into the water and having them degrade and break down. Next slide. Agriculture is another source of microplastics, and it really kind of surprised me once I started getting into this. Is kind of how many source areas are underneath agriculture, but primarily the issue is regards to stormwater erosion and transport coming off of agricultural fields. This is an example here of something of a storm system discharging off of an agricultural field and ultimately going into a tributary or a water of the United States. Next slide. So one of the major sources of microplastics coming off of these agricultural fields is the use of biosolids. And a biosolid is basically a byproduct or like a byproduct from wastewater treatment plants. It's the solid material. And this is the stuff that's got nitrogen, phosphorus, but it also has a lot of microplastics in it. And so it's used primarily by farmers to fertilize their fields. Over 21 million tons of biosolids are used in the United States, and 55% wastewater treatment plants use this technique to get rid of their sludge. So it's a very important use by agriculture in terms of fertilization in the fields and crops, etc. Very essential, but it's got to be controlled in terms of the erosion and transport coming off of the fields. So proper erosion control is absolutely needed by agriculture. Next slide. Then we've got plastic mulch material, and a lot of this is used in greenhouses, but also there's specialty crops that use them outside. A lot of times, what will happen is that after the growing season, the plastic material will be disposed of. We probably a lot of times by burning or just by letting it sit and degrade. Surprisingly, plastic is used for fertilizer in crops. It's like a slow release aspirin, which fertilizer is added to a plastic encapsulation, put into the soil, and it breaks down over time, which sounds great, but it's plastic. It's a plastic material associated with it, and it gets to be very, very small, micro size as it starts breaking down. Even the seeds that are planted are encrusted or encapsulated with plastic. Next slide. Then we get into, this is things that you've seen on, in the street, hopefully not too often, but we've seen this in terms of, especially after a storm event, a lot of plastic debris goes into the stormwater system that ultimately ends up in the wastewater treatment plant. Next slide. Or it ends up in a tributary, which would go into a lake, an inland lake, or actually like something like Lake Michigan ultimately, and creates a lot of debris. Next slide. I think this is a kind of an interesting one. This is more of an aerial sort of deposition in terms of microplastics. But garbage incinerators are a source of microplastics through the air. And it's called, a lot of people call it energy renewal or energy regeneration, where they basically use plastic as fuel to ignite and disintegrate the garbage. But there's air deposition problem with microplastics. And you can see from that map that there are a fair amount of garbage incinerators upwind and even downwind of the Great Lakes. So you can see where this is a potential, a significant source of microplastics, even though they are in the air. Next slide. So landfills, garbage landfills, dumps. So what goes into them? Not only are residential waste and industrial waste goes into them, but that sludge that I originally talked about, sometimes they end up in landfills. And so what happens is when it storms, when it rains, the storm water gets into the sludge pile, the landfill pile, and can either run off and go into a leachate pond, or it can start percolating down below into a liner that's either collected by a leachate pond. But the trouble is that these things are not really well maintained after they're constructed, and you can get a lot of runoff off of the leachate pond or even directly off of the landfill pile that goes directly into a ditch and directly into a surface water and ultimately into the lakes. So this is I don't have a sense of how significant this is. This is a lot of work that's being done in the United Kingdom, actually, in terms of really trying to quantify how big a source this is. But everybody's got a dump area in their particular regional of where they live. Next slide. So there's an industrial discharge of microplastics, and these are the nurdles. And so there was one time I went out to the beach and I saw all these cylindrical balls that you see up on the top right. And I didn't know what the hell they were. And so I started doing some investigation, and I'm finding out that's basically, this has been a spilled discharge of resin material that again is less than 5 millimeters. That's called a nurdle. And this is a precursor resin that's used in the use of manufacturing of plastics, mold plastics, etc., where they're heated and basically formed whatever object you want to make in terms of a plastic material. And so once these things are released into the environment, they end up, you can't collect them. And they're released sometimes with spills, literally in the millions that are ending up in the lakes. And so we've seen them on Lake Michigan, as I mentioned, but they're mistaken by animals and fish as food. So that's causing a food problem. And it's also causing an aesthetic problem where 70% of the beaches on the Great Lakes have recorded accumulation of these nurdles, which is again an industrial discharge. Next slide. So ecological impacts, those are one of the things, next topic I want to talk about. And it's complicated, it's complex. And I'm not going to talk about this graph in detail and bore you to tears, but this just kind of gives you an idea of how complex the linkages are and the research that needs to be done to do a cause and effect relationship between microplastics and the various types of ecological receptors there are for these microplastics. Next slide. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on the impacts. It's the so what, you know. And I think one of the things that really surprised me, this was about a year ago I came across this information, is that the average person in the United States, you know, we consume 5 grams of plastic a week. Man, woman, child, 5 grams. That's the weight of a credit card that we get from our food, our water, and our air. And so that was very surprising to me. Plastics, microplastics is found in placentas, in infant meconium. And also I've already talked about the impacts associated with the endocrine disruptors, but there's also food consumption. You know, humans are basically eating fish or eating plants that have got these microplastics within them. And we really don't know what the impacts are to us and to the fish that we're eating. Ecological impacts, the metals and toxics absorbed to the surfaces. I'll show you that in a minute. Fish mistaken it for food, talked about that. It gets into the food chain. Again, especially those small nanoparticles of plastic get into the food chain. And again, we really don't know what the impacts are to the fish and also to the humans that ingest them. And there's potential reproduction reductions that we see ecologically. Again, more research needs to be done in this area. Next slide. So this is just a diagram, a theoretical diagram of a microplastic and a small microplastic. And there's 2 things that are happening. One is that the materials that were used to manufacture the plastic, they're leaching out. Once they get into the aquatic system and they reach a certain size, they start leaching out materials that was used for their manufacture. And again, those additives, those toxic additives are in there. They basically get leached out into the water. So think of this microplastic as something that's ingested by a fish or even ingested by a human being. So we've got this leaching of this toxic material coming out of the microplastic. And then we've got chemicals coming into it, what they call adsorption, into and latching on to the microplastic. So we have things like DDT, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, herbicides, pesticides that are in the water are being absorbed and concentrated onto these particles. So that's just kind of a phenomenon. Again, what's the risk? What's the impact? That's really where the real research needs to be done in terms of really understanding what these impacts are to us and to the environment. Next slide. So just a picture of a fish that basically consumed microplastics. So what they end up doing is they end up starving. Once they start accumulating more and more microplastics, they basically starve. And so it could have an effect in a lot of the diversity of really specialized fish that we prize in the Great Lakes. And also, again, those nanoparticles getting into the actual tissue of the fish that we as humans consume. Next slide. Okay, so what do we do about it? You know, so so hopefully the doom and gloom is done. Okay, we can kind of be like, what can we do about this? It's impossible. It's not difficult. It's impossible to remediate the microplastics really once they're released into the environment. So regulations is one approach to try to do something, changing industry's behavior or trying to change behavior of people in terms of how they manage plastics. We're actually looking at the possibility of people buying microfiber filters, microfiber filters. And you can see a picture of that on the edge of the washing machine there. There's even discussions that I've read where manufacturers of washing machines may be required to put these types of filters onto their systems, and ultimately maybe having the manufacturers of the synthetic clothes actually help pick up the cost of those additional filters. Interesting concept. There are other materials that we can use besides getting away from plastics. I'll choose the synthetic clothes as an example. Can we use wool? Can we use cotton more often instead of automatically purchasing something that's synthetic? Agricultural controls, I kind of talked about that already in terms of erosion controls, of really controlling those microplastics coming off of the fields, stopping the human littering of the beaches. Stop smoking on the beaches. Actually have signs where you don't smoke. What a concept. Source control. Be selective of how we buy and basically avoid using plastics. Instead of a convenience, let's really find out if we really need the plastic before we buy it. An improvement in terms of wastewater treatment systems. Next slide. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with wastewater treatment plants, but a lot of times, at least this is basically when water comes in to be treated into a municipality. These are the real basic steps. And this is really to show that microfibers can be taken out of the system. You have the primary treatment. And basically, primary treatment is water coming into a wastewater treatment plant. It goes through a grit screen that gets rid of the coarse material. And then it's allowed to settle into these big settling ponds. You get about 57% reduction of microplastics just by settling the water coming into a wastewater treatment plant. And if you hook that into what they call secondary treatment, which is more of a biological system, which mostly wastewater treatment plants have, you get close to over a 70% reduction of microplastics if it's in series with the primary. And then if you're able to have a tertiary treatment, which is more of the high-end sort of treatment, more expensive, from UV, biofilters, sand filtration, et cetera, you get a 90% reduction. So there's you can see kind of that stepwise reduction and how that removal has been improved. But the trouble is it gets more and more expensive as you go further and further into the more exotic types of treatment. Not all wastewater treatment plants have tertiary treatment capabilities, and it's very expensive. Next slide. Nurdle controls, pretty easy. It's just good housekeeping. It's really basically using catch basins and screens to be able to catch this nurdle material once it's being transported, handled, stored, and actually going through a manufacturing process where it gets spilled into the storm drains. And a very simple sort of screen that is very effective. Employee training, best management practices. This just basically deals with a lot of common sense of how to control this type of industrial discharge. Next slide. So California had a problem with nurdles. They were having huge spills, and they recognized that nurdles, these microplastics, are basically impacting animals from ingestion, starvation type of impacts, but also the potential effect of the toxic effects from the chemicals and materials that are in the plastic. So it's a very progressive approach that the California used to basically created the nurdle law. And it was signed by Governor Schwarzenegger back in 2007, basically controlling the release of the nurdles, where it's more a stormwater management technique that some of the controls that I talked about previously are required by regulation. Next slide. So there's federal regulations that are possibly looking at. This is one by Senator Durbin from Illinois, who's a real anti-plastic sort of guy. He's my type of guy. And he's put this bill out early this spring in regards to, this is really focused on nurdles, this type of plastic pellet reduction. And he tried to hook it into the Clean Water Act. This has been sitting for legislation action for at least 10 months. And really not much action is really happening on this because I think it's just being overshadowed by huger legislative bills that are pending. So I hope that this will ultimately get some sort of traction. Next one. Next slide. So this is the home run ball, so to speak, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. I could spend the whole 60 minutes talking about the aspects of this, but it deals with almost every aspect of plastic management, from its design, from its manufacturing, to its recycling, to the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with it, to making specific requirements of making the material actually recyclable, getting rid of single-use materials, holding companies responsible for the plastics that they're dumping on municipalities, and actually having companies be responsible for picking up the tab for actually managing the plastic that they're actually dumping on the consumer. So controlling toxics that are used in your manufacturing. So this is a really all-encompassing bill that really addresses a lot of the problems that I had already been talking about. Next slide. And then there's an approach of actually just trying to tax the actual resin that's used in making the plastic, especially related to single-use plastics. And Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island came up with this bill of actually trying to tax the actual plastic resin that would be used for the single-use products. And that money would go towards managing recycling and that type of thing. But it does very little, if nothing, in regards to source control. Next slide. So these are just a laundry list of organizations. I haven't got all of them there, but there's just a lot of the material that I have been reading really are coming out of these universities. And so there's a lot of research that needs to be done, and a lot of research that's actively going on in regards to addressing microplastics in Great Lakes. Next slide. So what needs to be done? Makes sense to ask that question now. It's like, what needs to be done in the Great Lakes in terms of an overall management approach? And so the EPA and the International Joint Commission got together and developed a webinar of experts. It was a 2-day conference back in 2016. The International Joint Commission is a group that is from the United States, representatives from the United States and Canada, who are responsible for managing water resources and water quality of the Great Lakes. And so what needs to be done? So it's just it's like a simple thing to do in terms of really what needs to happen. Communicate research results to the public. Like it's a possibility that plastics could be in the fish that we eat, that type of information. Prevent plastic debris through education. This is really managing people's behavior, understanding what's going on, so they actually do get away from using plastics, or they actually recycle the plastics that they have, if they have that opportunity. Understanding ecological risk assessment frameworks. I've kind of talked about that already in terms of the impacts. We don't know what those cause and effect impacts are from microplastics. Talk about what things work in terms of actual reduction of using plastics. What sort of management models are out there that make it more effective to recycle, or basically to get away from plastics. Invest in solutions and research. Research this much more than that's what's being done right now between Canada and the United States. Develop bait and transport models so we understand where these come from and where they end up and how they move throughout the Great Lakes system. Great Lake, the extended product responsibility. I kind of touched upon that before, making corporations responsible for managing the waste that they put on the post-consumer, making them deal with the plastics in terms of recycling. And if they have to do that, then they'll start manufacturing plastics that are more recyclable, or they'll try to find some ways to reduce it. Getting away from managing agricultural fields, municipalities, developing these research linkages between these countries so they can learn from each other from their own research. This is amazing. Standardizing a way in which there's actually sampling and analytical methods for microplastics. There's no one uniform way to measure this. And it's a real problem, because if you can't measure it accurately, you cannot manage the microplastics. So this is a huge problem that California is trying to take the leadership role on. And finally, prevention precaution regulations by the state of Michigan. They could start doing something at a state level to start managing the microplastics. Next slide. I'm almost there. Thanks. Stay with me. So what can we do? Taking it down to a lower level, like us, as opposed to these higher end sort of organizations. What can we do to make a difference in terms of microplastics? First one's vote. Start voting for environmental candidates who basically see this situation as a problem, just like we do, or hopefully you do. Contact your local, state, and representatives. Tell them what you want. Tell them it's a problem. Support federal and state legislation as it ultimately gets developed over time. Recognize that we can't recycle our way out of this plastic problem. The manufacturing, the past, and the current and future production of plastic is so enormous that recycling alone cannot handle it. Modify our personal decisions about what plastics we buy at the grocery store and at the clothing store. Encourage the state to get involved. Start managing microplastics in Lake Michigan and in the Great Lakes. Develop letters to the editor. Develop editorials. Teach your kids about plastic and microplastics and what the problems are. Promote public outreach, education of plastics. Join an organization. Next slide. So I'm getting really low on time, but but I think this is the summary here. And I'm just reiterating some really big points here is that, recycling is not going to work. It's a complex issue in terms of using plastics. There's a risk associated with the toxicity of the chemicals that are used in plastics. They're on the shoreline. We see plastics every day that we walk out. New legislation promoting that. It needs to be done. Michigan can act if they want to, just like California, in an effort to protect the Great Lakes. Next slide. So I hope that you got something out of this presentation. I think that hopefully you'll become a little bit more aware of some nuances that you didn't know about. But I hope you walked away from the presentation that you realize that there is a water quality problem, and it's an upcoming imminent water quality issue. And so I guess one of the last words I could say is that, when you walk the beach there on Lake Michigan and you pick up a bunch of plastic in your hand, hopefully in a sick way, you'll think of me, but also you'll think about the presentation, and maybe it will kind of strike home to you about some of the real issues that are important in Lake Michigan. So thanks for listening to me. And I probably went a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I hope that if you have any questions or anything like that, I'd be glad to talk to you about them right now.
Are there any questions? I can't see anybody's hand. You can type them into chat, or if you don't want to ask them now, you can also email me and I can get them to Art. Let's see. No questions? I have. Oh, somebody?
Yeah, Steve here. Just a quick,
Okay.
Quick one. You had a list of things to do, but what can a person really do right this minute that could have the most impact?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for the question. I think just being smart of how you purchase plastics. It's called source control. Once you're able to stop the source control, like from not buying, water bottles, or not necessarily buying so much plastic wrapper material. If we can get, and basically, using reusable bags when you go to the grocery store, because what that does is it will cut down, obviously, the major plastic sizes, the containers, and also will ultimately reduce the amount or the capability or potential of having those reduced down to a micro size level. So I would say just being smart in how we really select the materials that we use in terms of plastics. That makes sense, Steve?
Sure does. Thank you.
Wally has a question. Is there any research on global level plastics and fish?
Oh, yeah, there are. Yeah, that's a big one though. But yeah, I think there was a lot of research being done in terms of the impacts associated with these gyres in various locations in the oceans. And so a lot of oceanographers have gone really directly near these particular mats of plastic and actually starting to take samples of not only the fish, but turtles, the aquatic life, and determining, really what they're ingesting, either in their stomachs or in their tissues. So I would say, yeah, there's been a lot of research done, but the problem is so enormous to be able to get your arms around it. Again, more research, right?
I have a question. Once in a while you hear about cans, the metal cans with the BPA free, supposedly.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that? You see
yeah, well, those are the things to look for, and I was really surprised at the reason why they have those additives in there. Again, a lot of people didn't know that they were in there, and they had a toxicity effect in terms of the endocrine. And so, we try to stay away from the BPA, and I don't taste the difference. I don't get a metallic taste coming off of the cans all that much.
Right. Are there any brands that you can think of that off the top of your head that we could let people know about? I need to do a search.
I guess not. No, but I would say if you're going to go to a place, I think there's an organic food store
Mhm,
there in Ludington.
mhm.
And also, if you go into the organic food shelves of Myers, and I usually shop Myers when I'm there.
Yeah.
I don't know about Walmart, but if you go to an organic section of the food area, generally, more than likely, those containers are going to be, toxin free, so to speak. And that's the one way to start shopping and looking for it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Jim,
Because again, if you think about it, they're giving organic food out. It has to be certified organic. So if they're putting organic certified food inside of a toxin laden container, that's not good. That doesn't make any sense, and it's very likely that's going to happen.
right.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
Any
there
other
is.
thoughts?
Jim
Oh, good.
Clark was wondering about using a carbon tax to reduce plastic in the environment and CO2 in the atmosphere.
Right on. Exactly. It's called this concept of paying the full price for the product. And you're paying the full price for the environmental damage that product causes. And plastics is a prime example because it is all fossil fuels. And so if you're able to start latching on a carbon tax based upon its carbon use, that's huge. And that would really reduce not only plastics, plastic manufacturing and consumption, but it would also do a lot for greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a whole different discussion item in terms of controlling fossil fuels in a very huge global way. So I agree.
Okay, Suzanne asks, are there any studies in Michigan regarding increases in human endocrine disorders?
No, I'm not aware of any. It's very possible that some are occurring, but I just have not seen anything in the literature as of yet of any university inside or outside of Michigan that's doing very much in regards to that. There is an organization called Break Free of Plastics. I think it's organized out of New York. And it's an old EPA official who basically started this organization. And they are very aggressive in regards to this use of phthalates in plastics and those preservatives in cans and that sort of thing. So there's some research that they've published, but they haven't been actually doing the research themselves. Okay.
Sarah asks, with regards to microplastics, is washing machine water discharging into a cistern as damaging as water going into a sewer system?
Well, I think I'm not exactly sure if it goes into a cistern, then does it go into a septic tank? Or I'm not exactly sure if I understand the question. Because
I think it's
if it goes into yeah, so if it goes into a cistern and ultimately into a septic system, the microplastics will be absorbed or latch onto the soil particles in your leach field. And so they're pretty much contained there within your septic field area. The question is that if you keep using that septic field over and over and over again, and it's overused or it's past its life, that material could end up getting into the groundwater because it's not working the way it's designed. The microplastics could get from the cistern, could go into the leach field, and ultimately end up getting into the groundwater or a nearby stream. Where if it goes into a direct sanitary sewer, Yeah, then it's kind of more open to the environment where it goes through a wastewater treatment plant. And as I mentioned, the wastewater treatment plants are not designed to handle microplastics. And so there's a more of a chance it's ultimately going to end up getting into Lake Michigan than from a cistern.
And Carmelita wonders about the laundry detergent pods that we can purchase. Is that still polluting?
You know, I've been trying to find the ingredients to Tide. You know, they're manufacturing these pods. And there's one of the concerns that I have, and I'm looking for it, are abrasives. You know, that abrasives that help clean the clothes at a micro level. And so I haven't been able to find this as of yet. I'm still looking to see if the Tide and other types of detergents are using those abrasives in that type of form. That's a really good question.
Mm-hmm. Anne asks, what about uptake of microplastics by plants?
Yeah, and that's a good question. There's been research done on that, and you know what they're finding is that especially if it's in soils that have been used for sludge in terms of fertilization and that sort of thing. And there's a study that was done that seems to be an effect in terms of the plant viability and vivaciousness in terms of ability to grow when they're starting to uptake these microplastics. And so there's a lady out of New York who has been doing research on that. And also it seems like that there's an associated with the microplastics, you start bringing in cadmium and chrome into the plant. Again, remember I mentioned that the cadmium and chrome, the heavy metals and the toxic have the tendency to attach to a microplastic. Well, those, if they're small enough, they'll go right up into the plant system, into the leaves, into the stem area. And it's affecting the growth of those plants because of the uptake of the heavy metals. But also it's kind of a concern of people ingesting that material where the heavy metals and toxics are concentrated in that particular plant. That's a really good question. And there is research that's being done.
And Anne says a lot, laundry pods are plastic. I've been told by septic people that they will reharden and will plug drain fields. Oh, great.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, right. There's so much out there.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, very good questions. Any more? I guess, if you have any others that, you're triggered, you can get a hold of me and I'll forward it to Art. And Art, thank you so much for taking your time and putting all your energy and your knowledge into this. This was really good. A little depressing, but it's important to know this, and we can all try to
we
do
can
more.
The thing is that we can do something about it, and it's in its early stages now. It's that upcoming water quality issue. So let's start addressing the problem now before it becomes a real problem like the other pollutants that have abused Lake Michigan in the past.
And if you have any other ideas, any of you, for other presentations, we're open to finding people to fill those slots. And I know Art is pretty knowledgeable about quite a few different things. But thank you, everyone, for attending our meeting, our annual meeting. And hopefully next year it will be in person, although Art wouldn't be in person unless you're here in the fall yet. But anyway, thanks so much, Art, and everyone. And I'm going to say goodbye unless there's anything else. And I will send out, this was recorded, and so we'll put it on our website and probably on our Facebook group. And I will send out an email with probably the link. I could probably do that along with a little more information about what we're doing. So thanks so much. Take care. Safe travels home. Bye-bye.
You said.
Good night.
that.